was able to get down here, and thank you for coming again. Thanks for so many of you coming back time after time. You're either gluttons for punishment or spiritual, heroes, one of the two. And so what I want to do is I want to start with some things about fundamentalist attacks or questions, or however you want to put it. And there's going to be so many things that we won't be able to get to. I'm trying to give kind of a big picture of certain things, and then we'll probably do some Q&A directly related to that. Take some questions from you about that, and then hopefully we'll have maybe about 20 minutes or so to go through a quick concluding section on the resurrection, which is actually it's kind of a shortened talk from about a 45, 50-minute talk that I give on the resurrection. But I want you to have a sense of the main objections that are given to the resurrection and some of the responses that you can give to that. Because again, it's one of those things where people say, as I mentioned before, oh, anything could have happened. Or we just never can know. Well, actually, there are things that we can know, and no, it's not true that just anything could have happened. There's a limited number of possibilities, so we'll talk about that. And then maybe if we have time after that, maybe do some more Q&A. And I do have the promised bibliography of some books that I recommend. And then, of course, I put it together today, and as I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking of the 3 or 4 books that I didn't. But there are so many amazing resources, not just written, but of course video. We've talked about Bishop Barron and others who've done marvelous work with social media and so forth. I personally am a book guy. My personal library, it's not like Scott Hahn's. I've been in Scott Hahn's personal library years ago, and I probably was committing acts of sin as I was thinking of how I could steal all those books. I think he had about 80,000 books at that time in his personal library. That's a lot. It's even more. He actually finally just took that whole library, and I think most of it is now as part of the St. Paul Center that he has there in Steubenville. My personal library is only about 20,000. So much to the dismay of my long-suffering wife. But this is a list, and I'll hand those out at some point. There's just, I really try to focus on truly apologetic-driven books and not just works of theology, even though the two are directly related. Okay, so fundamentalism. We got into it last week. We talked about some of the history, right, which I think is important, understanding a little bit where that comes from. And there's this strange tension between Catholics or Catholicism and what we'll call fundamentalism / evangelicalism. And I think the tension for me, being a former fundamentalist and evangelical, that was the stage I went through, becoming Catholic, was becoming more evangelical, is that on one hand, of course, we have these arguments and debates, which used to be very, very contentious, of course. There's a very anti-Catholic theme that runs through America's history. As you know, here in Oregon, we know, many of you know about the background and the KKK and all these different things. But on the other hand, when it comes to more evangelical Protestants, we have, in many ways, a really shared understanding of so many things, a shared faith about basics, what we might ironically call the fundamentals, right? Whereas many liberal Protestants, and even, unfortunately, what we might call liberal Catholics, will deny or undermine things about, say, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, or even the divinity of Christ, or, say, the sacraments or various things. Evangelicals actually share with us many of these basic things, even in some cases aspects about salvation, and even to some degree some aspects of sacramental belief and theology. It's a really hard thing to get a grasp on, as we, I think, saw a little bit last time. But when it comes to more aggressive, like anti-Catholic arguments, we end up looking at a number of basic topics, and we've hit some of them before. And I have a list of what I think are the top 10 of things that come up. And it's kind of subjective, but if you had to say what's the number one topic that comes up, if you have a fundamentalist friend or family member or something like that, what's the number one thing they bring up? What would you say?
Mary.
Mary, I heard Mary.
Pope.
Purgatory, yeah, excellent, yeah. So I would put Mary at the top. And this is not a hierarchical structure, this is just purgatory. And then, did anybody ever say like the Eucharist? That's kind of down the, it's really interesting. These two are really huge, push the button issues for so many especially, and this is something to keep in mind, especially fundamentalists who really know nothing about Catholicism. And I'll tell you, one thing to keep in mind, I would say with 95% of fundamentalists, and again, I have to speak kind of generally, but I think it's really true. They know less about the Catholic faith than most Catholics. That's how bad it is. Okay. No, they seriously, and it's not just that they don't know it, it's worse than that, right? Going back to our first talk, we talked about removing impediments. They have built on this lack of belief all these false beliefs. So, for example, of course, with Mary, they think we worship Mary, right? Or we worship the Pope, or we think the Pope can't sin, or they think that the Pope can make up any belief that he wants, and we have to blindly obey it. Or they think that Mary is somehow elevated and becomes almost like a fourth person of the Trinity, right? I mean, these are, on one hand, they sound like an exaggeration, but there is a whole kind of subset of Protestantism in which those are the beliefs. I would say Eucharist is very much in there as well. The Jack Chick comics, which I mentioned last time, one of the most famous of the little Jack Chick comics, which was probably first published back in the 70s, was titled, does anybody know this? The Death Cookie. The Death Cookie. And what Jack Chick and his minion of fundamentalist comic book creators argued is that if you believe the Eucharist is actually the real body and blood of Christ, you're actually committing an act of apostasy and idolatry, and that damns you to hell. So the Eucharist for them becomes the death cookie. Now you end up in a weird situation. One of the strangest conversations I ever had about the Eucharist was with an evangelical friend of mine. I went to Bible college with him, and then he ended up moving to Eugene, and we ended up spending time together. And he surprised me because we got to talk about the Eucharist, and it was shortly after I became Catholic, and he said, I don't see what the big deal is. You believe, it's the body and blood of Christ, and I think it's just a symbol. He said, it's just not a big deal. I said, well, think this through a little bit. If the Eucharist really is the body and blood of Jesus Christ, as Catholics believe, as Orthodox believe, then why would you not want that? Why would you not desire that? Now, if it's not, then what I'm doing, Jack Chick is actually right. If it actually isn't, if it is just bread and wine, then yes, you actually are committing an act of idolatry. You really are. It's an all or nothing proposition. There's no just whatever. So his approach was more like, it's whatever works for you. Well, that's not really a robustly Christian approach to anything. So the Eucharist comes up for a lot of debate. Of course, there's arguments that made about, if you cut the Eucharist, you don't see, you don't see blood and all this stuff and whatever. And it's a complete faulty understanding of the nature of the Eucharist, which is, it is the true body and blood and soul and divinity of Jesus Christ. But the change is not physical, it's sacramental. It is the true and real body and blood of Jesus Christ, but the change is sacramental. That's even something that I think a lot of Catholics struggle with too. And we can maybe talk about that in hour number 3, if we get there. Purgatory, I think I mentioned the story about the conversations I had with my parents about purgatory. It's a second chance. It's like a third option. And so I think purgatory to me is the easiest thing to talk to fundamentalists about. It really is. It's really so easy. And I went through it before, but I think the thing to convey to them is that as Catholics, we believe there are only 2 destinations after you die. That's the thing you have to emphasize if they bring up purgatory as a second chance, is to say, no, it's not. There are only 2 destinations, heaven or hell, presence of God or separation from God. And then purgatory then has to be put in its context in relationship to heaven. You know, C.S. Lewis describes it, the washroom of heaven, which I think is a great little analogy or kind of image of what purgatory is. Of course, there's the whole issue of, kind of related to the Pope, but also the issue of the Bible, right? And then you have, like, where did we get it? Is by faith or by Scripture alone? It's very common, of course, for most Protestants, but certainly fundamentalists, to say that Scripture alone is the final authority. We'll talk about that in a moment. I'm going to get into that a little bit. And then there's the whole issue of salvation. How are we saved? Because they think that Catholics believe they're saved by doing what? Works, and worshiping Mary. And that's how I was raised. I mean, I had Catholic friends, and they were friends. I mean, it was unfortunate they were going to hell. I was trying to help them not do that. I knew they had to understand that salvation was not a matter of works, simply by faith alone, etc. We're going to talk about that in a moment as well. And then directly related to Mary is the whole issue of just the saints in general. You know, the communion of the saints. And then another big one that comes up, and we won't be able to get into this too much, there's some really good books on the list, though, about this, are historical questions. We did talk about this briefly last week, I think. The big ones are Crusades, right? Yeah. The Spanish Inquisition, which I know we talked about last time. Millions, 80 million killed. And then things like Galileo, that comes up a lot. I mean, it's kind of ironic how sometimes fundamentalists will actually argue that the Catholic Church is anti-science, when fundamentalists historically are very anti-science in certain ways. Anti-intellectual might be a better way of putting that. And then, of course, here, of course, is the nature of the Reformation, which you're not going to be able to read this by. What happened? What really happened in the 1500s? What really went on? Was the true church saved from the clutches of papist, Romanist, horror Babylon type of things, or was something else going on? Something else was going on. That's the short answer. And then there's some issues of morality. We won't spend too much time on this, but I think we talked about a little bit about drinking, playing cards. Cards are the devil. Well, and that varies. I mean, I've seen a wide range. I actually, true story, when I was at Bible college, 1989 to 1991, just a couple years before I arrived there, they had finally changed the rules so that female and male students could actually hold hands at certain times, at certain places. But there was overall a 6-inch rule, okay? And actually, there's something to be said for that. I'm not saying it's bad at all. But of course, no alcohol at all. But what's really funny is you were not allowed to play any cards on campus. So a friend of mine and I, about 3 or 4 times, we just kind of made a deal out of it. We would just go into town, which is about 10 miles away, go to a donut shop, and we would play cribbage. We were out of control. We had such a good time, we felt guilty. But we couldn't go to confession because we weren't Catholic. It was horrible, the tension. And then finally, another big one that I put on here, how many we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Pretty close to 10, would be end times. And I went over this last week. I gave kind of the cursory. But of course, in fundamentalist eschatology, and eschatology is that fancy term for what we believe about the end times, the Catholic Church plays a prominent role. I mean, when I joke about the Catholic Church being the whore of Babylon, that's what many fundamentalists believe. Part of the background for that is a book called The Two Babylons by a Protestant polemicist named Alexander Hislop. And that book was written, I want to say in the 1840s, somewhere around there. Anyway, it was regurgitated in many ways by people like Tim LaHaye, who co-created the Left Behind series, which, by the way, the entire plot of the Left Behind series was almost entirely plagiarized from another book that was written in the early 70s called 666 by a guy named Salem Kerben. It just gets so convoluted. It's like a bunch of end times nepotism. But Hislop, I want to say that he was Presbyterian. I could be confusing him with Lorraine Bettner, who wrote a book called Roman Catholicism, which is like this thick and is remarkable in that it contains absolutely nothing true about Roman Catholicism. It's really amazing. It's astounding. And he attempted to present it as being scholarly. Hislop's was just over-the-top sensationalist, and it was all about the mystery pagan religion of the Catholic Church, and it had just all these crazy things saying how, like, the belief or Catholic beliefs about Mary were directly taken from the pagans, the Babylonians, and the fertility goddesses, and I mean, it just gets really, really wacky. So it kind of ties into that whole conspiracy theory aspect, which is kind of always around the fringes with many fundamentalists. It's there. It just it depends on the particular person. It depends on the particular setting they come from. It can vary a little bit. One thing you get is that fundamentalists will say, well, Catholics don't actually believe in the second coming. I've heard that before, which is really strange, because anybody who goes to Mass will know you recite the Nicene Creed, which talks very distinctly about Christ coming again, right? In glory to judge the living and the dead. So again, it's that removing of the impediments. But even really, one example here real quickly, even intelligent evangelicals don't get it. Down in Eugene, there's an institution called Gutenberg College, which is it's kind of a great books program, but it's run by some Calvinists. What's interesting is they all have doctorates in like philosophy and other things. And I've met them, and I've had conversations, arguments with them. But very nice guys, very smart in many ways. But I remember they did a radio show once. They were doing a radio show, and they were talking about the Eucharist, and they were saying, well, I'm not sure. I think what Catholics believe is that at some time before the Mass, that the priest says some prayers, and that's when they believe that it changes into the body and blood of Christ. But I don't know. And I'm thinking, well, you could always just go to a Mass and observe it, or you could pick up a thing called a book, and So it's interesting how there are assumptions made, and a lot of times people won't actually examine them. And what you find is one reason that a lot of people won't examine it, I think intuitively, is because they know if they start going down that rabbit hole, they're not coming out the other side a fundamentalist. As John Henry Newman famously said in his book on the development of Christian doctrine, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. And Newman said that as someone who began writing that book in 1840, 1839, somewhere in there, as an Anglican trying to prove the Catholic Church not being the true church. And he finished the book as a Catholic, right? Because he was a church historian. He was actually, I don't know if a lot of people don't know this, but it's kind of overlooked that Newman was a serious patristic scholar, church father scholar. He wrote some really serious academic works on the Arians and the Arian heresy and Council of Nicaea and so forth. At the middle of all this, I want to go back to this point that I made a few times already, and I think it's just key to make it here, is it's almost pointless to try to argue about any of these things without explicitly making reference to the person of Jesus Christ. If you're talking to fundamentalists, you have to. Well, you should, obviously. Because the thing you want to impress upon a fundamentalist, and this is just a big picture thing, they need to see that you, as a Catholic, are first and foremost a disciple of Jesus Christ. And the reason you're a Catholic is because you want to have communion with God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's why. Not so you can worship Mary or follow the Pope blindly or escape purgatory or play cards or drink. Although drinking beer, that's a good reason to become Catholic. Shouldn't be the only reason, but it's a good reason. Or, avoid reading the Bible, whatever it is. So this is really, really key. And to show these relationships is key to making the connection between all these to the person of Christ. Yeah.
I've heard them say that we aren't Christian.
Well, So that's And that's kind of that distinguishing line that I've talked about between the fundamentalist and the evangelical. The fundamentalist will just flatly say, or it will come out at some point, well, you're not really Christian. Or you might think that you're Christian, and you might hold to some beliefs that are kind of quasi-Christian, but you as a Catholic, that's not really Christian. So you really are making a case, of course, for Catholicism being authentically Christian, and not just authentically Christian, but the Christian faith. As Hans Urs von Balthasar, the great Swiss theologian, said, Jesus Christ is Catholic. He is the perfect Catholic. I mean, you think of, obviously the word Catholic means universal, and it refers, we use that in different contexts, but Christ himself is the universal means a way of salvation. And he founded the Catholic Church so that men and women could be saved, right? So there's a way of kind of where you play defense, and then you also have to kind of go on the offense at times too, and have to gauge that.
What are they basing this on? What's their stereotype, or their lack of knowledge, or their overthinking it, or underthinking it?
I think in my experience, I think the vast majority, 9 times out of 10, maybe more, it is just part of the water they swim in. And that Catholicism is treated this way to keep it at arm's length. So to give a small little telling example of that, the last time that I attended the Bible chapel in Montana that my dad co-founded many years ago when I was 5 years old, I was Catholic, but we went there. Our daughter had just been born, and we took her there so people could see her stuff. And I remember sitting through the adult Sunday school, and one of the longtime elders there, who'd known me since I was a little boy, he made this interesting comment about, the Gospel of Luke. They were going through the Gospel of Luke. It's the Gospel of Luke, and he said, some would say Saint Luke, but we're all saints, so we don't use those terms. He said that for my benefit. I know he'd said that. But see, this captures fundamentalism. The fear is we can't appear to be even close to Romanism because it is so bad. It is so contrary to, they believe it's contrary to Scripture, and it just comes from this tradition of not even knowing what Catholicism is. And there's a lot of historical strands for that. I talk about Hislop, but it goes really back to the Reformation and so forth. David?
The most common one I've heard is because they say, do you believe that you're saved by your works? And for them, a really important part of, it's true that you're saved by the grace of Jesus Christ. Your salvation, that makes you very non-Christian. It loses the point for them.
Yeah, I think that's a big one at the core of it. Is they think that what you're doing, I think if you had to put it a different way, for most fundamentalists, Catholicism is not Christian because they think in some way it detracts from the centrality of Christ. That's why I'm so big on having to emphasize the centrality of Christ with them. And to explain that everything that we believe about these various things has to do with the person of Christ. A great example of this is Mary. And I think it's one of the easier ones to show. And I gave that example, I think, already about Mary being the Theotokos, the Mother of God. I had that little argument, and I've had that with 3 or 4 different fundamentalists. Again, for those who might not have been here, it's, do you believe, you're talking to the fundamentalists, you say, do you believe that Jesus Christ is God? Of course they do. We share that, even though if they don't think you might not. But they say, well, do you believe that Mary is the mother of Jesus? Oh, yes, of course. And fundamentalists do believe in the virgin birth, even if they might not accept the perpetual virginity of Christ. They do believe in the virgin birth. That's one of the fundamentals of the original fundamentalist movement. And then you say, okay, so if Jesus Christ is God and Mary is the mother of Jesus Christ, then Mary is the mother of God. And their response will almost always be the same. No. And as I always say, well, let's walk through it again. But that's again an example where they think, well, you're putting Mary somehow above Jesus Christ. You're saying somehow that Mary is somehow above God or equal to God. And so here's the key point too. Historically, fundamentalists, again, I think it's safe to say without being disparaging at all, the average fundamentalist knows absolutely nothing about church history other than kind of these myths they've been told, right? So there can be this intimidation about, well, they're going to bring up things like the Reformation and the Crusades and so forth. They don't know what they're talking about. So if you do a little bit of study and read some of the good Catholic materials, you'll know a lot more about it than any of them will know about any of those things, I guarantee you. Because in their mind, they'll say, well, the Spanish Inquisition, millions killed, right? All these, and in more extreme cases, like in the Baptist tradition, there's this belief in what's called the Trail of Blood. Everybody heard of that? It's pretty obscure, but it's there. And they believe that from the time of basically, well, especially Constantinople, but even before then, that the true Christian faith was suppressed for all these centuries. And all the true believers were persecuted and killed by the Catholic Church. And that finally Luther and men like John Smith and Ulrich Zwingli and others finally began to break through. And they pushed through and they brought true Christianity in the light of day. And they broke this demonic hold of the Catholic Church. That's the historical vision that many fundamentalists have. So you can see it's a little bit different than how we as Catholics would approach it, right? But like with, the Catechism has a great paragraph that I don't have in front of me right now, but, it states everything that we believe about Mary is rooted in our belief about Jesus Christ. So if we talk about Mary being the mother of God, it's because, going back to the early councils, it was emphasized that Mary is the mother of God to defend the divinity of Jesus Christ. It wasn't ultimately about Mary, because Mary herself says it's never ultimately about Mary. Mary is always about Jesus Christ, her son, right? And we hold Mary in the highest regard, first of all, because her son, who happens to be the incarnate Word, etc., holds her in the highest regard, right?
Yeah, I've had some fundamentalists deny the physical birth of Jesus.
Oh, really? They go that far? Yeah, that sounds right. I mean, maybe it's maybe extreme, but it makes sense logically. So what happens is there's this distinction that's made, a false distinction, which goes back to the heresy of Nestorius, where he says, well, Mary is Christotokos, but not Theotokos. She's the mother of Christ, but not the mother of God. And there's a split. And so, of course, the councils have to come up with things to fight this. They develop understandings of how to articulate what is really going on. For example, the hypostatic union. There's a lot of heavy-duty theology involved there, but it's always aimed at the person of Jesus Christ. So the irony here is that the fundamentalist approach, I don't know how exactly to put it, it's contrary to everything they say. Here's a great example: salvation. What do fundamentalists emphasize when it comes to salvation? We talk about faith alone, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But what's the big thing? You need to have what with Jesus Christ? Personal relationship. Okay. And yet, when you end up talking to a lot of fundamentalists, especially those who might fall on the more Calvinist end of the spectrum, what comes through is this heavily juridical view of salvation. By that I mean, well, we're saved, we're damned, there's nothing we can do. That's true. There's nothing we can do to save ourselves. And the blood of Christ covers us, and God, the Almighty Judge, who is, of course, angered by sin, he looks down and he sees, instead of seeing us, he sees the person of Christ. And in the courtroom of God, this cosmic courtroom, he says, well, I'm going to render you justified by virtue of my son's work, saving work, and ignore the fact that you are still this horrible sinner. Now, of course, this comes true with Luther as well. Variations on this. What's funny about that is when you read the Council of Trent, even though it uses kind of scholastic language, is it's very personal. It talks about salvation being the transference from the domain of us being sons of Adam, fallen, sinful, and desperate need of salvation, into the realm of the second Adam, the new Adam, Jesus Christ. And it talks about salvation in terms of deification. It's not, in the Council of Trent, it's not super overt, but it's there. That we actually are filled with the divine life of God. We're actually filled with the divine life of God, and in receiving the Eucharist, we actually take the true body, blood, soul, divinity of Jesus Christ into our bodies. So which version of these is more personal? Right? Which is more personal? That's the thing I come back to, is when you talk to fundamentalists about the Eucharist, is to emphasize, well, you talk about how personal relationship with Jesus Christ, how much more personal can it be than to actually be able to consume the true body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ? It cannot be more personal than that. I mean, there's a nuptial, marital reality, too, going on in the Eucharist. So trying to convey that, though, can be very daunting. So one of the things that has to happen, too, and I have to tell you, over the years, I've done a very mixed job of this myself, is to try to hone in on one thing and stick to it. Because what you find, and this isn't true just of fundamentalists, right? This is true of anybody, is, you start to answer that question, okay, but what about this? And what about... You have to have the discipline and the patience and the charity. I have none of those, but you'll have to have the discipline, patience, and charity to say, wait. Let's stick with this particular topic. Let's follow it through logically. You have to follow it through logically to its end. Let's see what actually is said. So for example, with the Eucharist, one of the most interesting discussions I ever had about this with a fundamentalist was the pastor I mentioned, Richard, who was kind of a mentor to me in my early 20s, and then he's the one who said, well, you're going to hell, which caused problems in our relationship for some reason. He actually brought up this question of Mary, and he said, well, what about Mary's other children?
Yes.
So, long story short, I went through and showed how the Greek word adelphos, which is used to refer to these men and women, is used in a very global way to talk about those who are cousins and close relatives. That this is very common in the Jewish way of speaking, and that Greek word captures that Jewish idiom. There's more to it than that, but that's the basic point. And that there's other evidence that, in fact, Jesus was the only child of Mary. And then his response is very interesting. He said, well, this is the problem with you Catholics, is you make everything symbolic and metaphorical. I said, that's funny. You mentioned symbolic and metaphorical. Why don't we talk about the Eucharist? Where Jesus says, eat my flesh and drink my blood, 6 different times in John chapter 6. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. I said, we don't take that metaphorically or symbolically. And by the way, this saying that my understanding of the other children of Mary was metaphoric or symbolic was actually inaccurate, right? I wasn't saying they were metaphors or they're symbols. I'm saying there's a different way of understanding the language used there, right? So he was misrepresenting that. And he said, let's talk about the Eucharist where Jesus, especially in John 6, says, eat my flesh, drink my blood. And he got angry, very angry about that. I said, I don't understand why you're angry. It's a legitimate question because I never once, in all of my time growing up as a fundamentalist and going to 2 years of Evangelical Bible College, I never once heard any sermon on John chapter 6. It's 63 verses. It's kind of a big deal, right? Never once. It's remarkable. So this for me, when I'm asked, why did you become Catholic? What was the thing? I would have to kind of come back to the Eucharist because of the historical evidence, the scriptural evidence, the theologic of the Eucharist. Now, here's one of my favorite arguments for the Eucharist. And I think this might work with a thoughtful fundamentalist, certainly with an evangelical. I think it'll get them to think a little bit. And that is, and this is taken from G.K. Chesterton, and I think it's on his book, Why I'm a Catholic. He wrote 2 different books on his conversion. To paraphrase him, what Chesterton said was, in fact, of course, he does it in a completely unique style, but he says, well, I just don't understand why it is that Protestants will say, oh yeah, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and I believe that he's the second person of the Trinity incarnate. I believe that. And then, when the Eucharist is brought up, they say, oh no, we can't have that. That's idolatry. He said, which is more scandalous and more unbelievable? That God would become man, truly become man, become flesh and dwell among us, or once having become man, he then is able to offer himself to us in a unique sacramental manner by his divine power. Which is more scandalous and more amazing? The first, the incarnation. The incarnation and the Trinity being the two great central mysteries of the faith. So here's a case of having it backwards. You say glibly, yeah, I believe Jesus Christ is God, he's the incarnate Word. Sure, fine. No. But then when it comes to following the logical thinking behind the Eucharist, and when you think of John 6, you think of what St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, and you think of the uninterrupted historical record. That's the thing that got to me, was I began to read the early church fathers, the apostolic fathers, and what I discovered, this will shock you. I'm glad you're sitting down. I discovered that the apostolic fathers were not American fundamentalists. It was a mind-blowing experience for me. What I discovered is they believed in this thing called the Eucharist, and they celebrated it, and they were willing to suffer for it. All right? And by the way, here's where we can employ, too, what I sometimes call the Eastern Apologetics. As I mentioned, I attend a Byzantine Catholic parish. But one thing that's sometimes overlooked, and I think could be used a lot more by Catholic apologists, is appealing to the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Christian beliefs. So, for example, with the Eucharist, fundamentalists will get really hung up on transubstantiation, right? They want to really get into, that's all this scholastic language and blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, you can argue about that, or you can step back and say, well, here's the thing with language like transubstantiation. It is a particular way of using a philosophical and theological language to try to explain part of the mystery, okay? But if you step back, in the Eastern churches, which of course don't embrace scholasticism as a theological language, they've always believed that the Eucharist, the mystery, is the true body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And the ancient Oriental churches, which were kind of, for centuries, kind of separated from communion with Rome, they've always believed that. And yet they're not Roman. I mean, obviously Eastern Catholics are in communion with the Roman pontiff, but they're not Roman or Western or scholastic, and yet they've always believed that. I remember a few years ago, I was on a Catholic Answers cruise, and I don't think I gave this story here. I have like 10 stories, so sometimes. The really short version is that there was, if this sounds familiar, let me know. We're talking about Eucharistic adoration. Did I mention this? And a couple folks here might know it. So these folks were from Seattle. They were in charge of Eucharistic adoration in their parish, and wonderful, fantastic. And there's about 15 of us around the table, and she said, do you have Eucharistic adoration in your parish? I said, no. We don't do Eucharistic adoration in the East. I might as well have said that the Pope was the Antichrist. She was horrified. What? What do you mean you don't do? She said, no, in the Eastern tradition, you don't have Eucharistic adoration. Not the same way you have in the West. I said, in the West, it came about and it became very emphasized during the Protestant Reformation. Why? Because you had all these Eucharistic heresies. Luther started to move it. He started to change it. Calvin went further. Zwingli just ditched it completely, right? So Eucharistic adoration was a way of combating that, of emphasizing the reality of the Eucharist. I said, as my pastor told me once, this is quite funny, he said, in the East, we've had all kinds of Christological heresies. We're great at those. But we've never had a Eucharistic heresy. Never.
Are you saying that the divinity of the Eucharist for Catholics is neither symbolic nor literal?
Say that again?
I guess the question, are you saying that the divinity of the Eucharist is neither symbolic nor literal? It's some third.
Well, I like the language that the tradition uses, which is the Eucharist is the real or the true body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. What I'm saying is that the change that takes place so that what is bread and wine become the true body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ is not physical. It's beyond physical. It's sacramental. It's at the very quiddity essence of what that thing is. And that's why I think transubstantiation, actually, I think that explanation, when you understand the distinctions made within that Aristotelian Thomistic paradigm, actually are very, very helpful.
So the reality you're talking about is a sacramental reality.
A sacramental reality. So what happens is that sometimes people fall into the trap of thinking that sacramental or spiritual is somehow symbolic. It's not symbolic. Well, I see this.
It's also not literal.
Well, it's an actual change. It's a literal.
Look at it under a microscope.
It's a literal change, but it's not happening in a physical way.
Yeah, that's what literal
Right.
and physical.
Right. So Frank Shee does some really good things on the difference between, say, the spiritual and material realm. And his basic thing that I think is really helpful for us is that as real as we think the material realm is, the spiritual is far, far more real. Far more real. But when people in our culture today talk about spiritual, they either equate it to symbolic or so vague we have no idea what's going on. And both of those understandings of spiritual are completely contrary to the Catholic tradition. We say, no, what is spiritual is God himself is spirit, and he is the ground of all being. So you start getting into some of those things. Man, it's amazing how fast this goes. So I want to talk about, for a couple of minutes, about the whole issue of once saved, always saved, because we broached it at the end of the last talk, I think, and I wanted to bring up 3 or 4 verses they're very helpful. And I remember I was struggling to remember where this one verse was at. And it's from 2 Timothy 2. 2 Timothy 2. And in the course of this letter to Timothy, his spiritual son, the Apostle Paul says, and it's interesting here because Paul is clearly quoting an established saying that predates him as an apostle. I think it goes back to somehow the very beginning. And he quotes it, 2 Timothy 2:11. It is a trustworthy statement. He writes, "For if we died with him, Christ, we shall also live with him. If we endure, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself." So the fundamentalist will kind of instinctively grab onto, the once saved, always saved person will grab onto the part, well, he remains faithful, he can't deny himself. And my point that I was making last week, now that we have the verse here, is God is always faithful to the covenant, always. But that doesn't mean we can't walk away from it. And Paul makes it very clear. If we deny him, he also will deny us. And all you have to do is think about Matthew 24, 25, and the parable of the sheep and the goats, right? It's one example. There's others where clearly, if you don't live the way you're supposed to live as a Christian, your relationship with Christ will end. So that's the problem, with this juridical understanding, this courtroom understanding that so many fundamentalists have, is it's not true to personal relationships. It's not true to the kind of relationships we understand, whether it be friendship or familial or marital. It doesn't relate in any way to those things. A couple of other examples real quickly about, that are problematic when it comes to belief that once you're saved, you're always saved. Some of you know this. There's only one place in the New Testament where the words faith and alone appear together, right?
There's no.
What's that?
It's not anywhere, right?
They occur together in one place.
You know this Bible.
And it's just that I don't know where it's at. It's actually in James 2. I'm actually using a Protestant Bible. This is my Ryrie Study Bible, New American Standard, which, by the way, the New American Standard is essentially the same thing as the Revised Standard, the Catholic Revised Standard. But this is the Charles Ryrie Study Bible. And Charles Ryrie is one of the big-time rapture teaching dispensationalists. I use this all the way through Bible college and have all kinds of notes in it. And it's very helpful because whenever I struggle with the meaning of a verse, I look at what Dr. Ryrie states, and then I know that the opposite is true. It works out so good. This is going to sound so small-minded, but in Bible college, we had to read, in one of my courses, I had to read Charles Ryrie's book called Basic Theology. It was one of the worst books of theology ever written. It's dreck. And he was just huge in those circles. And it's about a 600-page book. I talked about church and how church is just like a spiritual thing for fundamentalists. It's not important as like with Catholics. Guess how many pages in the 600-page book had to do with ecclesiology, like ecclesiology? Like 4. That's amazing. I mean, that is just astounding to me still. And I still have it. It's one of my 20,000 books in my library. So James, this is part of a longer section, James 2. You know, Martin Luther wanted to get rid of a couple different books of the New Testament after he made his break. And one of those was James, and one was the book of Revelation, which he thought was just, crazy. And obviously the book of Revelation is difficult. But he wanted to get rid of James because James says, what use is it, my brethren, if a man says he has faith but he has no works? Can his faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. And then a little bit later, he says, you see that a man is justified by works. This is James 2:24. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. So the whole idea of sola fide, the classical Protestant notion that we're saved by faith alone, is directly rebutted by James in chapter 2 of his book. So how do we get around it? Well, Luther wanted to get around it by just getting rid of James. Nice try, Marty. His close friend, Philip Melanchthon, who was more level-headed than Martin Luther, which, by the way, was not hard to be, said, no, I think we've pushed things far enough. I don't think we can start tossing out books of the Bible, right? So the short thing here is that this is the only place in all the New Testament where faith alone is used, and it's specifically to say that faith alone does not work. It's not. So what you see is the dynamic of the relationship. Again, if grace is just the external favor of God, which is essentially, and I'm being a little bit simplistic here, but if grace is just the external favor of God, as Luther and Calvin essentially taught, Luther was all over the place. He was not a systematic theologian. Calvin was more systematic. Then there's various things that follow from that. But if grace is the actual divine life of God, the Trinitarian life of God, which he wishes to actually impart to us through Christ, as Romans 6, Paul talks about, baptized into Christ, rising to life with him, etc., etc. 2 Peter, become partakers of the divine nature. Galatians 4 talks about being children of God. I'm going to read one more passage about that connects all this in a moment. Then all of a sudden we have a completely different dynamic. We recognize that it's deeply relational, and if that grace is the actual life of God, then when we sin, we harm it, we damage it, and we can actually destroy it. We can sever that relationship, and we need to restore it. But if it's just an external favor, then there's a completely different dynamic. You're just covered by this appearance of Christ. You don't need to worry about the interior part of it. That's for a later activity called sanctification in the classical Protestant tradition. In the Catholic tradition, the two are intimately linked. You can't really separate the two. You can only distinguish the two, right? Then we begin to understand about the Eucharist. The Eucharist is actually, first of all, baptism, of course, is entrance into the divine life of God. The Eucharist is the nourishment that comes from that. Confession is the reappropriation or re-entrance into the life of God after we've sinned, but we go and confess our sins and so forth. All the sacraments participate in grace being the actual divine life of God, and that is a huge, huge difference between the two traditions. So the last verse I want to read here, a section about this, and I think it ties it all together, is 1 John. I'm doing books of the entire Bible, but it's not often, read. I'm not sure how often it appears in the 3-year cycle, but here's the section I want to talk about, and that's 1 John 3. See how he ties all this together, hopefully. He does. We'll see if I have, okay. 1 John 3, See how great a love the Father has bestowed upon us that we should be called children of God. But I say this as a mere metaphor. I'm just making this up, says John. No. Listen very carefully to what he says. See how great of love the Father has bestowed upon you that you should be called children of God, and such we are. Period. It's not a metaphor. It's not poetic. It's truth. For this reason the world does not know us, because it does not know him. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we shall be. We know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him just as he is. He's getting at a very important principle of Catholic belief, which is we live in this tension between this world and the next, right? John Paul II had a very fancy term for this. Eschatological tension. Eschatological tension. We're pilgrims in this world. We're meant to be completed in the next, but we're here. Here's one of my solitary insights. I really believe that one reason that a lot of fundamentalists get so wacky and so many other non-Catholic Protestants get so bizarre in their belief system is because they do not have a way to resolve that eschatological tension. They don't have a way of dealing with the fact that they're meant for the other life, and yet here they are, and they should be actually participating in the divine life of God, but they don't know how. Now, if they're baptized, they actually have been. And they have, because we do recognize Christian baptism in other traditions, right? The Eucharist is sanity for us. The Eucharist is the means by which we stay sane, because we are at the marriage feast. We already participate in the marriage feast that we're called to, Revelation 19, 20, 21. We're able to, have that timeless moment of actual communion with God. But if you don't have that, I think you'll lose your mind. You'll lose your spiritual orientation, right? I really do believe that. Then, the last little bit about 1 John, and then we'll take some questions. And this is where it ties into the whole issue of once saved, always saved. Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. And we know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. And no one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. Little children, let no one deceive you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. Did you get that? The one who practices righteousness is righteous. Why? Because they do it on their own? No. Because they are united with him, and they are true children of God. So when we as children of God do good works, we are actually being Christ-like in a very true and absolutely real sense. It's not poetry, it's not metaphor, it's real. But the one who practices sin, he says, is of the devil. For the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, that he might destroy the works of the devil. No one who is born of God practices sin. No one who is born of God practices sin. It's so judgmental. Oh, I don't know if John could be an apostle today. Because his seed, God's seed, abides in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. You see this language? It's mind-blowing language. A lot of times, I remember as a Protestant reading this, like, this is very poetic. This is very nice. Then you start to think, wait, he's serious about this stuff. Right? Okay, then a couple more verses. By this, the children of God and the children of the devil are obvious. Anyone who does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor the one who does not love his brother. On and on. It's amazing. So what he does is he brings it all together. The fact that we participate in the life of God, the fact that that is actually growth in holiness and righteousness, and that we can lose our salvation, we can actually have rupture of that saving communion with God if we sin and fail to do the things we're supposed to do, which is everything from helping the poor, the widows, and so forth, and of course, loving our fellow brothers and sisters, etc., right? So you see the connection. It's holistic. In Catholic theology, it all ties together. It's not like these little compartments. Right? Right? So, okay, I'm going to stop on the fundamentalist stuff there because been going on a little bit here. And actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take some questions. I want to hand these out for folks who want to look at my book list and then question. I'll give you half of those. This is a semi-infallible list of books. Now, these are books that I think are very helpful. I've tried to list every book that I've mentioned in some kind of substantive way. I've tried to put it down here, and I've broken it out. The first larger section of books, you'll see if you haven't got it yet, is kind of a big picture apologetics. For example, one that I really highly recommend, Handbook of Catholic Apologetics by Peter Kreeft, and he was just here, right? Not too long ago? Was that?
Maybe last year.
Was that part of?
That was a Newman lecture.
Okay, gotcha. And he wrote this with Father Ronald Ticelli, both of them at Boston College. Father Ticelli might still be there, but Peter Kreeft is now, gosh, he might be almost 80 years old now, but he's not slowing down. I saw him last October, and he's talking about these 7 or 8 books he's working on. He's insane in the very good sense of the word. Then I have books on addressing Protestantism, historical questions, skepticism and atheism, and the Jesus Christ in the Bible. There's a lot more books that could be on here, but I think these, if you were to get a few from each of these, it would give you a really good starting library if you want to develop one. And then also, a lot of these, of course, have copious footnotes and bibliographies where you can kind of branch out, those particular issues that interest you, go from there. Okay, maybe for about 5 or 10, 15 minutes, we'll take some questions about fundamentalism, and then we'll take a short break.
I just am curious, when you get into these engagements with people, how successful are you as far as your arguments, and do you?
Well, if success is measured by people changing their mind right then and there, not very successful.
Do you have people come back and say, I've been thinking about what you said and that sort of thing? Just, it seems to me sometimes it gets to be a debate, and you want to score your points, and they want to score their points, and then game over.
And thank you for mentioning that, because even though I would never commit that kind of egregious act, here's a book I forgot to put on there. This is really bad because this is written by my boss, Mark Brumley, president of Ignatius Press. He wrote this a few years ago. This is a new edition of it called The 7 Deadly Sins of Apologetics. Excellent book, and this is one of the points. Of course, it's a basic point, but it really needs to be made. If you're just trying to score points or win an argument, you've already lost. You've already missed the whole point, right? There's nothing wrong with having a rigorous debate. There's nothing wrong even with being kind of direct. It depends. It depends on the relationship you have. It depends on all those prudential factors that you have to take into consideration. My own track record in terms of direct success has been, I'd say it's somewhat limited. Where I've actually gotten the most positive feedback is people who've read stuff that I've written and then say, that article you read helped me. The one that sticks out to me, because it meant a lot to me, was Dr. Francis Beckwith, who's a former, he was actually the president of the Evangelical, what do they call it, Theological Society, very prestigious. He became Catholic about 10 years ago, but in his book on it, he mentions some things that I wrote, which, meant a lot to me. So, I do like to point out the fact that the Apostle Paul, when it comes to immediate success, had a really bad record too. So at least I know I share something with St. Paul. Yes?
You said 7 Deadly Sins of Apologetics was written by your boss, but actually...
Yeah, the 7 Deadly Sins of Apologetics, Mark Brumley. Mark Brumley. Yeah, let me put the name up on the board. Mark is he's been my boss for many years, president of Ignatius Press. He's one of those guys, when you say, hey, have you ever heard of this author? He's like, yeah, I read all this stuff. He was one of the original apologists of Catholic Answers. But his own background is he was raised as kind of nothing. He grew up in kind of a nothing environment. Became evangelical in his teens, just through reading, C.S. Lewis, that kind of thing. And then in his 20s became Catholic, and then eventually became one of the staff apologists at Catholic Answers. And then from there, after a few years, he moved over to Ignatius Press. Great little book, though. Lots of great advice in there.
Wasn't Lewis a Catholic?
C.S. Lewis?
Yeah.
No, he was an Anglo-Catholic. He was he had everything pretty much right, except he had no ecclesiology. I'm not saying that facetiously. C.S. Lewis wrote tons of stuff. He writes almost nothing about the church, the nature of the church. It's remarkable. Both Thomas Howard and Joseph Pierce have written books and articles about that fact, and that they see that as one of the few real weaknesses of C.S. Lewis's thought, who is a remarkable apologist. I mean, I have Mere Christianity on there. C.S. Lewis is fabulous. You may know that he wrote some fiction too. What you might not know is he actually wrote 2 or 3 volumes of poetry. Yeah, I have those. I've even read them.
We just finished reading a book by Dudley.
Bromley?
Pardon?
Who's that?
Was Dudley?
Who I mentioned just a moment ago?
Yes. No, I mean, he mentioned C.S. Lewis a lot.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, that doesn't ring a bell. Dudley?
What was he was at the University of Portland.
Yeah, but it's
an
not.
author, really?
It's not ringing a bell. Must not be any good. I've not heard of him.
I'm probably got the names mixed up.
No, C.S. Lewis is, he is rightly considered to be one of the, the best, one of the greatest Christian apologists of the 20th century. I think that Frank Sheed, who I've mentioned before, and I put 3 books on there. I think Frank Sheed is every inch and more Lewis's equal in that regard. Sheed did not write anything like Narnia, though, so. But Frank Sheed is a phenomenal apologist, yeah. Chloe?
So this is an issue about Mary that I've encountered. And it's about the Immaculate Conception. Because I had a discussion with someone, and basically he said that, the person I was talking with said that he thought that Mary did not need to be immaculately conceived in order to be the mother of God. He said if God could do such a thing as make Mary without sin, he could just as well have the power to have the Son of God be conceived by a sinful woman.
Yeah, I think the question is about the Immaculate Conception and why this need to have Mary born without sin, conceived without sin. Why is that necessary? I think part of it's a mystery, but part of it also goes back to the reality that what's going on with Jesus and Mary is the new creation. And there's an Adam and Eve. Christ is the new Adam, Mary is the new Eve. And both Adam and Eve, of course, were created without any sin. They chose sin. Mary could have sinned at any time. This is something, by the way, a point sometimes you have to make with fundamentalists. You say, Mary had the free will. She could have sinned at any time. Mary wasn't floating across the ground 4 feet off, 4 inches off the ground. She chose throughout her life to always do the will of God and certainly the will of her Son, freely. So I think this is where you get into, I think this is where the Church Fathers are so good, is that to emphasize this new creation and the reality of it. But also because Mary is we really believe, and it's really important to believe, that Mary is the first disciple. The first disciple. So her example, well, first of all, that's crazy because we know the Catholic Church hates women, right? I actually brought this up with someone once. They're like, oh yeah, Catholic Church. Actually, he was kind of an atheist. And I said, well, then why do we why does the Catholic Church make such a big deal about Mary? He goes, oh, yeah, Mary, okay, fine, whatever. Like, well, it's a serious question. If the Catholic Church hates women so bad, why is the most venerated human who's not divine also, why is it Mary, you know? And so what we see in Mary, and this is, I think, the reason why we've had these two great Marian dogmas proclaimed the last 200 years, is to point to this reality that we are supposed to be just like Mary. In fact, we're not just supposed to be, we can be. Now, we all have sinned. But by God's grace and through his supernatural divine aid and so forth, we actually are called to be what Mary is. A disciple who is completely filled with the life of God in the communion, you know, in the presence of God after our death. So I think there's that as well. And part of it is just the prerogative of God. But I think that the whole logic of the Old Testament, when we know the Old Testament and we study it more and more, we realize that this is completely fitting, right? So the argument that I would make even further real quickly would be, when we think about the sin in the Garden of Eden, what was the sin? What was the sin that was committed? Pride. And that's right. And at the heart of pride, and I don't know if we always think of it this way, what is the essence of pride? Me, I can do it. But it also goes to the reality of, I don't need to love God. I love myself, and that love of myself is enough. It is sufficient. It's about love. Ultimately, the test in the garden was about a severing of love. I think this is something that comes up in the theology of the body, right, sister? Very much. It's really big, I think, in John Paul II's theology of the body, that the test that takes place in the garden is about love. Who do you love the most? What would you live or die for? And Adam and Eve failed that test because they decided they were going to live for their own desire and their own pride, rather than submitting themselves fully to the plan and will of God. And that's what we see with Mary and with Christ. We see that perfection. Now, I think part of it too then is we say, well, Jesus has an advantage. He's God, right? Well, setting aside that whole thing, I think this is part of the reason too that Mary is conceived without sin. She's given this unique opportunity to live sinlessly of free will so that she can open the doors, so that we can follow her. She doesn't save us, but she opens the doors. I mean, in many different ways. I mean, she is the door, right?
There's a very important thing about Jesus, in that he is God, but he also is
fully human. That's right. And so there's always this tension that we have to keep in balance, which is very difficult to have both. And of course, there's really complicated questions about, well, if Jesus, could he have actually sinned? I mean, it says that he was tempted just like us, etc. I can't solve those questions tonight, but so it's a great question. Mary just really bothers a lot of fundamentalists because they think that by putting any attention on Mary, you're taking away from Jesus. That's what it is. And so I think we have to say is, no, we love Mary because she is the perfect disciple. She's the mother of God, and she shows us the way. She always points to Christ. I mean, I think this is one of the most powerful things about Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, is it shows that really in a really dramatic, almost iconic type of way. I think I'm going to stop here for about 10 minutes. I think we need a break. I know there's no alcohol allowed here, but I think there's coffee and such. And then we'll come back in a few minutes. I'm going to do a little thing on the resurrection. Yes, Father?
There are cards allowed.
Capital Sinatra. Okay. Resurrection. Oh, actually, there's a question I should take up really quick. Someone in general, it's a great question. You know, it's really tied to this. What about, statues and icons and all this paraphernalia? Because it's true. Many fundamentalists are very ascetical, stark, however you want to put it. I think I may have mentioned how the little Bible chapel I grew in, we just had a big bare cross. That was it. Actually, it's not it. At the very back, there was a picture of the rapture. Yeah, the rapture happening and people going up, Christians, true Christians, none of you guys, going into heaven. while cars are crashing and planes are crashing. So, you got the cross, you've got the rapture, what else do you need? But every Christmas we'd have like this, the nativity set, But you had the bare cross because Jesus was no longer on the cross, but then Jesus was somehow in the manger again. So there's kind of this, but there is kind of an iconoclastic aspect to fundamentalism. I think a lot of it comes down to the Calvinist tradition, which historically, if you know anything about Calvinism, was very, very anti-image, anti-statue, anti-even art. Luther was never really this way. Calvin, though, made a point to destroy, and then it really took place in England after Henry VIII, went bad. The destruction, the dissolution of monasteries and the destruction of the interior of churches and stuff. It's really remarkable. I think the thing that I emphasize when I've talked a few times to fundamentalists about this is why would you think having, once God became man, became human, and is still human, what would be wrong with recognizing and having images of him, and just explaining to people, of course, that when you pray in front of a statue, you pray in front of an icon, you're not worshiping them. That's one thing I didn't really touch on. This idea of worship. For fundamentalists, this is really important. For most fundamentalists, any kind of prayer is deemed worship. That's not true for Catholics. For us, prayer is communication, communion, conversation. And it's really funny because I even had this conversation once with my dad where he talks about how, Mary, why would you pray to Mary? She can't hear you. She's, he actually said that she's in Sheol. Like, what are you talking about?
Where?
Sheol. That's what he's like, what? The grave. Like, why would you think that? It's such a weird perspective. And the thing that emphasizes, we really believe as Catholics that there are those who, having died, have entered into the presence of God. And are they more or less alive than we are now? That should be a no-brainer, that they are fully alive. They are fully realized. Right? So why wouldn't they want to have communion with us and have some kind of conversation or correspondence in some way? I mean, it's really strange how in fundamentalism there's almost like an odd anti-supernaturalism. It's impossible to describe if you haven't lived in it. It's just really, really strange. But yeah, there is kind of that iconoclastic mentality, and it's just it's a strange deal. I'm going to, in the next, what do we got, 2 hours? Okay. Does using the board help at all? My handwriting is basically somewhere between chicken scratch and. I could have been a PhD, or I could have been a doctor. So I want to go through just a few things about the resurrection. I want to do it kind of in a semi-logical fashion. The first question: did the resurrection happen? Actually, we'll begin further back. So I talk about this in my book. Did Jesus really exist or not?
Yes.
We're going to say yes, but I do talk about in the book how there are those who say, well, it's stupid to talk about the resurrection when Jesus didn't even exist. And the point that I make, to put it real simply, is you will not find any kind of reputable historian of the ancient world who says that Jesus did not exist. Even Bart Ehrman, do we know that name, Bart Ehrman? Former fundamentalist who's now, I can't tell this story, it's kind of crass, okay. He was, Bart Ehrman a few years ago, he's written a bunch of books basically trying to prove that so much of what we have in the scripture is not true, and it's been corrupted, and there's all kinds of problems with the New Testament stuff. And he's a legitimate New Testament scholar. But he actually ended up writing a book titled, I think, Did Jesus Exist? Where he just lambasts like atheists and skeptics who say, well, Jesus never existed. So even Ehrman, who basically has denied everything taught by Christianity, has no part of that. So yes, Jesus existed. So when it comes to the resurrection, did it happen? Well, you have yes and you have no. So over here, what are the options? Well, he's dead. That's it. Game over. Go home. Right? He did not rise from the dead. What's another option? His body, or he himself, was swooned. As one of the big theories that was very popular in the 1800s. The swoon theory, not to be confused with the swan theory. Just not a theory, but the swoon theory, where Jesus he went unconscious on the cross. His body was taken down. They thought he was dead. And then when they took him to the back room, he miraculously woke up. They revived him. They put some Band-Aids on him, and he was all good. And he showed up a few days later and said, "Hey guys, here I am. I was cut to pieces, and I was, shredded, and I basically lost all the blood in my body, but here, I'm good to go." And I kind of make fun of this in the book, Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead? Because this was hugely popular among liberal German Protestants. Again, so redundant. In the 1800s, this was a big, big thing. And it's been kind of brought back by a few people, more on the fringe conspiracy side. But the big problem with the swoon theory is what we know now about the crucifixion and how the Romans tortured people. There's no way in the world. Roman soldiers were good at two things: hurting people and killing people. That was it. They weren't good at yodeling. They didn't write great plays. They either brutalized people and or killed them. So the swoon theory just makes absolutely no sense. There's also the idea that, this is all just a conspiracy. How many here have heard of the book? It was really big in the late 60s, the Passover plot. Anybody remember that? It sold like several million copies, 3 or 4 million copies. And the idea there was this is a big, elaborate conspiracy where Jesus pretended to die. He got all this, he had this all set up. And what's really funny about the book is he goes through all this, and then Jesus just kind of wanders off into the desert. And it's like, well, what was he actually trying to accomplish? It's never really clear. It's like he wanted to pull an elaborate joke on everybody, and then he just walks off, and nobody takes this seriously anymore, except, again, people who are really into conspiracy theories, which, come to think of it, is quite a few people. So that, when we talk about historical evidence, swoon theory, conspiracy theory doesn't work. Part of what could go, another theory that goes along with this is hallucination theory. Right? You've heard this one?
No.
Well, there's been variations on the theme, but basically it's like, well, Jesus was dead, but some of the disciples began to have hallucinations of him. And to the point where hundreds of them had hallucinations of him. The big problem with hallucination theory is that psychologists and studies, especially in the last several decades, have shown hallucinations are highly individualized. You cannot have 500 people have an hallucination of the same thing, where they all collaborate and they all say, this is what happened, this is what he looked like, and this is what went down. It just does not happen. Hallucinations are incredibly specific to an individual person. And so to say that all these different people at different times, including Paul, who, by the way, was going around killing Christians, all of a sudden he has an hallucination for no reason. He's not using peyote or anything. He's just going after the Christians, and boom, all of a sudden he has, it makes absolutely no sense. So, going through this in a very quick order, but the key thing is that when you get to some of these more extreme theories, it just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever that would happen. One that is a little bit more daunting, and I take more time of it in the book, is a conspiracy theory where the apostles, they know he's dead, they took the body, they hide it, and that's of course what the Jewish leaders said too, right? They stole the body. And that they then came up with an elaborate story for the followers of Christ, the other disciples, and presented it, and said, we've seen him. He rose from the dead. He appeared to us, okay? Everything is fine. What's the problem with this? Keeping in mind they would have had to stole the body, which means they knew that Jesus was dead. What's the number one problem with this? People do not suffer and die for lies. Human nature. When push comes to shove, if you know it's a lie and you know it's completely made up, you don't suffer for it and you don't die for it. But this would have involved all the different apostles who would have been in on it. They would have had to say, we're willing to live a horrible life of poverty and persecution and die for this because why? There's no benefit. I mean, we know that none of the apostles got rich, right? None of them had wealth. None of them had power. Quite the contrary. I mean, we see it again and again. They're persecuted, and we know that Paul, for example, who had a very prestigious position and was going places within the Jewish religious system, he threw it all away. And he suffered, the list of things that he suffered goes on and on. Stoning and whipping and all kinds of different things. So one of the little anecdotes I tell in the book related to this is Charles Colson, who I mentioned last time, who became a Christian while in prison, having been one of the inner circle for Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal. He talks in his biography, he has this anecdote where he says, and he's actually using it in connection with the resurrection. It's really interesting. He says, there were basically like 5 or 6 guys who were the core group of President Nixon who knew what was going on with Watergate. And he said, we swore that we would not break rank, that we would stick together. He said that lasted about 3 weeks. So his point is human nature. You don't lie and die and suffer. You don't suffer and die for things that are absolutely untrue. But this one holds appeal for a lot of people because it helps them do away with it. No, they just made it up. It's a big story. So I think you have to come back to human nature and say, why? And it's not what we see in the historical record. This is something that I'm kind of assuming here, but the historical record in the Gospels, a lot of people don't like to take it seriously or think that we can just, it's all kind of vague and it doesn't add up and so forth. But in fact, it's quite amazing that we have 4 biographies. Let's just talk in strictly historical terms. It's unbelievable that we have 4 major biographies of an itinerant Jewish peasant preacher. It makes no sense. None. When we think of ancient biographies, or we actually look at what ancient biographies are written about, what were they? Who were the subject matters of ancient biographies? Pop stars, kings, emperors, heroes and warriors. That's about it. That's pretty much it. There are 4 of these. 4. And there's been an amazing, I can't get into it, but there's been an amazing amount of work done in the last 10 years by mostly evangelicals. There are some Catholic scholars who are looking into the nature, the Greco-Roman nature of the biographies, of the biographical nature of the Gospels. And the key point here is that they show that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John follow in very exacting ways the kind of standards and methods that were used by Greek and Roman biographers at that time. They approach history a little bit different in some ways than we tend to think of approaching history, right? But it doesn't mean that it's not true or it's made up. It's more that they put things together in a certain way that follows these criteria used by the Greco-Roman tradition. A name to keep in mind here, I don't think I have any of his books on the list because they're all about 600 pages long. Craig Keener, he's coming out with a major book, it's like 800 pages this fall. Yes, I pre-ordered it. Where he's doing a major study on this. I think it's going to be very interesting. Because one of the things that people have said, so for example, people say, well, the Gospel of John isn't really historical. I mean, John just does his own thing, right? Actually, what we've seen in the last few decades is that Scripture scholars have said, no, he's incredibly historical. It's just that he puts together his material in a certain way. He's not as interested in strict chronology but he's absolutely interested in what actually happens. You know, we have this thing where it's like, well, if it's not chronological, it's not true. That's not the case. Chronology it just depends on what the goal is. And John, in his details especially about the Jewish feasts, incredibly detailed and incredibly accurate to what was going on at the different feasts of the Jewish liturgical year. Okay, so let's say that Jesus. So the point here is there's remarkably limited and weak possibilities if we say that Jesus did not rise from the dead. If we take the Gospels halfway seriously, and we should, as historical documents, we should take them seriously. So if Jesus did rise from the dead, there's a couple different possibilities. It was a resuscitation. I'm going to spell it wrong. That's resuscitation. I'm writing out resurrection. It's like so what, you know, say, well, no, he rose from the dead. What happened actually is he passed out, or he actually did die, and then he was revived. He did come back to life in some kind of miraculous way, and then later he did actually die. Another possibility is, well, he rose from the dead, but not really physically. It was a spiritual resurrection. How many here have heard of Marcus Borg? Yeah, we're in Corvallis, right? This is something that men like Marcus Borg and others from the Jesus Seminar and people like John Shelby Spong, who's an Episcopal priest who doesn't believe anything in the Bible. It was a spiritual resurrection. In fact, what they say, people like Borg and then, I'm totally blanking on his name, the Irish scripture scholar, they'll say, it doesn't matter if we find his body or not. That's not important. We just need to know that Jesus spiritually was resurrected, and he is alive to us in some very real way, and the body doesn't matter. What's the problem with that approach? The New Testament never presents it that way, never. Either in the Gospels or in the writings of Paul. Paul emphasizes, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, again and again and again. Christianity is inherently so pro-body and pro-material realm because God created it. It's good. So this is not true at all to the New Testament record. It doesn't follow it at all. So the option then is that it was a true resurrection. And that this resurrection event involved Jesus' actual physical body, which is somehow transformed by the power of God. It's the same body, transformed, glorified, and we honestly don't really know how to comprehend that, but we get hints of it, right? Jesus walks through walls. He eats food, and yet it's not really clear that he needs food. He kind of appears and disappears. You know, he has entered into another dimension, and I think that's really true. He has entered into another dimension, but he in no way has forsaken this dimension. And so this becomes the centerpiece for everything that the church and the apostles teach right from the beginning, as I emphasized at the very beginning of this a few weeks ago. I feel like I'm missing one of the... You know, this is, by the way, this is sometimes called the myth theory, where you have this mythology. Here's one of the things that people don't take into consideration. I'll finish with this, and I think it's really, really important, because the resurrection is a historical event. Christianity of all religions. What's interesting about this? That's a very short amount of time, a really short amount of time, right? How long before the very first account that we know of that exists is written down about the resurrection of Christ? When is that written?
47.
47? Good. Yeah, 47 or 48 by Paul in his letter to the Thessalonians. That's a really remarkably short window of time. Why do I bring this up? Because what I found in my experience, what happens is people are like, oh, all this time passed and just a lot of confusion and people began to speculate and they began to make stuff up. It's like, no, not at all. You had the resurrection. A few weeks later, we have Pentecost. Peter, who, by the way, was not even close to the cross when Jesus died, right? He's out there just giving it. You read in Acts 2 the Pentecost sermon by Peter, and it's just like, what happened to this guy? There's only one thing that could have happened. And I come back to this point again and again and again. There's no way to make sense of anything that we read in Acts of the Apostles, the existence of the early church, the witness of the martyrs, the witness of the early church father. None of it makes any sense based on any of these theories. It just makes absolutely no sense. So I sometimes refer to the resurrection as the Big Bang inside of time. Because you get into this with atheists about, well, where did everything come from? Well, there was a Big Bang. Well, where did that come from? Well, we don't know. Maybe it could have been by somebody outside of time who actually created time and matter. Oh, we can't scientifically prove that. Well, okay, but we know it happened, so it makes sense. This is the only thing, the resurrection, physical resurrection, glorified body, etc., etc., that makes sense. It can explain this incredible Big Bang. And I also call it the Big Bang in time because everything that we know about this, and it's written down, comes from this really short period of time, of about 25, 30 years. So even though John writes his gospel a bit later, 80 to 90, Matthew writes his probably in the 60s, they, of course, are drawing on experiences that go right to the very beginning. Even Paul, when he's writing his very first epistles, it's like I indicated from the quote from 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy earlier, he's already quoting Christological hymns that have been used already by early Christians, right? And again it comes back to the resurrection of Christ. So this is a super, super compact approach, but I really emphasize this short. And of course, Paul, what's he do after 2 years in the desert? He goes and he spends, 15 days with Peter? There's a great, he's actually Protestant, Martin Hengel, great Orthodox German Protestant. Yes, change of pace. He actually wrote a book like this thick on what was Paul doing in those 2 or 3 years. It's crazy. And so, it's really funny because it's a super academic book. He's got all these footnotes and stuff. And then he gets to the point where he's talking about, and I quote it in my book, he meets with Peter and Hegel says, so what do you think they were talking about? The weather? His point is, this is all that Paul and Peter talked about. What did, and Paul, of course, having not lived with Christ, wanted to know. What did he teach? He wants to know everything. They weren't discussing the latest Grammy Awards ceremony, as fabulous as it was, right? So I think that people can miss in the historical record in the Gospels and Acts all these little details and how it all makes sense and points back again and again to this incredibly radical, revolutionary break into history by God, the fulfillment of the incarnation and the death of Christ. Any super quick questions about any of that?
Where does Luke come in?
What's that?
Luke, where does he come in?
Well, Luke becomes, I don't think that we know exactly sure when Luke meets Paul, but it's pretty early on. And from what we understand of Luke, he of course was Greek, and of course there's been a lot of belief, it makes sense that he had some kind of a medical training and background. But the thing that's remarkable about Luke, when you read his gospel and you look at the various clues, is that he was obviously trained in writing histories. And what's happened over time is, especially in the last century or so, and this is putting it kind of simplistically, but for a long time after the Enlightenment, especially during the 1800s, liberal German Protestants kept saying, well, we can't trust any of the history of Luke. Like, he keeps bringing up dates and names and stuff that make no sense, so we don't know anything about. Well, guess what? Luke's been validated on a lot of those, and more all the time, through archaeology and through other studies and stuff. Luke was incredibly precise. He took great pains to preserve an accurate historical picture. Doesn't mean that everything that he says makes complete sense. There's things that are lost to us or we don't know for sure, but Luke's accounts, which of course are incredibly significant because Luke, the Gospel, and Acts of the Apostles make up about 1/4 of the New Testament. So they're huge. And of course, he spent a lot of time with Paul. So he's very, very significant in that regard. And that's who we get a lot of almost the majority of, certainly about the Mary and the
Well, how did he
conception.
get involved? I mean, he was a Greek, the other
Right.
guy.
Well, he apparently was a Greek who was very interested in Judaism, and it's somehow through that interest in Judaism, and he somehow makes the connection with Paul. I don't think that we know exactly how he was introduced to Paul, but he clearly is attracted to Paul and his teaching, and becomes very, very closely joined to him in his apostolic endeavors. We know that certainly, that he travels with Paul. But I don't think that we know, without just guessing, how that actually came about. But probably very, very early on, after Paul returns, he meets with Peter, probably right in that same period. Perhaps in Jerusalem itself, he meets Luke. We don't know. So, any other quick questions? So, yes.
Yeah. So when I'm talking to my friends or people I'm trying to have little debates with, I will need your phone number so I can.
Well, yeah, for $200 an hour, I'm happy to. Well, you can buy the book. No, I think the thing, to come back to conclude and talk about apologetics, I just go back to some of the things I said at the beginning when we started, which is just know that there's always going to be stuff that you don't have answers to, but know that that's totally fine. And in fact, see, you got to flip it the other way too. I've never gotten to somebody, talk with somebody, argue with somebody where I'm like, man, they're just bringing up stuff this just, wow. No, it's always like, okay, you have some good questions and points, but all this stuff has been addressed. Every single one of these questions has been addressed in some way, somewhere in the Catholic tradition. We have so much wealth in terms of material. So it's just a matter of being willing to say, hey, I don't have an answer for that right now. I can get you an answer. I'm happy to do some research to get back to you. There's nothing wrong with saying that. I think that kind of honesty goes a long ways with people. Rather than get defensive, and right, that's really key. And then just really try to read the situation. Every situation is so different. I've had kind of barn burning arguments with people, and I've also had just very, what I would call kind of soft conversations, where it was just more, I made it clear that I just wanted to hear what they were saying. It's hard for me to shut up and listen, but it's good, and just let people bring it out. And maybe that I don't think that that's successful because I don't see something happening with them, but I like to think that at least gives them a different impression of what a Christian is. That a Christian isn't some kind of dogmatic person who wants to beat your brains in, but is actually willing to listen and hear what they're saying. And I think you have to be willing to go away from any of these conversations knowing you're probably not going to have any kind of obvious success. Because the success always depends on the Holy Spirit and the openness of a person's heart, which we have no control over, none. Yeah.
Success shouldn't be the aim of the conversation.
Well, when I say success, well, yeah, and that's true. And so, success means we're looking at, are they reacting positively? Are they wanting more? Well, maybe they do. So we have to kind of set aside that criteria and realize that the goal is to see that we actually care and want to listen, that we're not, again, dogmatic jerks or whatever,